Welcome back to the county seat. We are having a discussion today for our entire half hour with Congressman Rob Bishop from the state of Utah. And in our last segment, if you are just joining us, we talked about the federal take or the national level take on House Bill 148. And during the break, I kind of posed a question. How are you going to sell this? Because that's the main objection, is how do you sell this to your colleagues whom, as you said in the last segment, don't really care that we are being picked on out here?
So one of the things that we have done differently as Western representatives in Congress is we sat down with some of our friends and tried to do different arguments and see what actually resonates with them. So for obvious reasons, I picked Ohio and Virginia because that's where my Speaker and Majority Leader hail. This map simply shows the blue is how much private property is owned. So that's the private property that's taxable and developable in Ohio and in Virginia, and you compare it to the state of Utah. Now, usually when people look at this, they always go like, wow, I had no idea, because they really clearly have no idea that that is what is the reality. But in the back of their minds, they also say, well, yeah, so what? So what we thought we had to do is try and answer that part, which is, so what? And to make sure that they understand that they have a skewed vision of what they're doing. In the 1960s, the Park Service decided that it could get more money if it had more parks in more districts. So they went on a rampage, and actually there are now national parks in 49 of the 50 states, even though it's only 13% of the land. However, most of the land controlled by the government is actually BLM land. It's only found out here in the West, which means when we talk about public lands to Easterners, they see a pretty tree by a beautiful lake. That's their image. You're talking to us in the West, and we see BLM land, which is sagebrush and is easily developable. So there's a mindset that's different. That's the first thing we get across, is you're thinking differently than we are, and it's costing you money. You may want to keep that, but you are spending $8.5 to $9 billion every year to control the West. So if you really want to keep that skewed vision, fine, it's going to cost you money. And with tight budgets, all of a sudden that makes a difference. And then we plow on to what they're doing to our kids. Down here is obviously everything in red is what the federal government owns. They'll say wow again, and they don't realize that 1 out of every 2 acres, half of the West, is controlled by the federal government. But the states in red here are the ones that have the hardest time raising money for their public education systems, and there is a relationship, which simply means, look, over the last several decades, the West has been able to increase their funding for public education by 35%. The East has done it by 68%. So it's a simple a matter all of a sudden of saying, look, you're harming our kids. You're paying out of the pocket to do it for this false vision you have of the reason you control the West. Why do you keep doing that? And all of a sudden, they're starting to think about, yeah, I'm paying $8 billion, and for what? And I'm hurting your kids at the same time, which it doesn't make me feel good. For what? So the opportunity of changing the dialogue, in a new paradigm shift is about time. And we're starting to couch our terms in ways that we're throwing it back at them saying, do you really want to keep giving me money for nothing? And do you really want to keep harming my kids for what you're doing? It's changing. And I think that compared to what the state's doing, or combined with what the state's doing, we have a different style of doing this. Historically, about every 50 years, it seems to be a paradigm shift of how people view public lands. It's been 50 years since we had the last paradigm shift. I think it's about time that the attitude can change, and we're on the cusp of actually doing that.
Okay, sell me on something else. Let's talk about the Endangered Species Act and the problems that we're having out here in the West. I mean, currently on the table in Utah, we have issues with prairie dogs down in Iron County. We have problems with the wolf up in the northern part of the state. And we could very potentially have a problem with sage-grouse everywhere. And it seems that these are now being at least perceived as new ways to control, restrict, and shut down access to public land.
We have been using the Endangered Species Act for that, and that has been the cause. And sometimes, in our efforts to compartmentalize issues back in Washington, we don't realize the impact of one on the other. So, for example, if indeed this Interior Department wants to put a $1 administrative fee on every grazing permit, even though it's supposed to be $1.35 for the AUM, and they want to do it as $2.35 and claim they have the ability to do it, their goal and one of the effects will be to take grazing off public lands. You take the grazing off public lands, and all of a sudden you allow all sorts of cheatgrass and other species that not necessarily are helpful to sage grouse to grow, and choke them out. And you increase the chance of wildfire, which takes away habitat, and all of a sudden you have these two aspects coming together that will ultimately say, for the Interior Department, their goal is to let's control everything. They don't realize how these two factors are working at cross purposes. And yeah, the sage grouse issue could be one of the most significant issues that is facing the West in an effort to stop development and stop even traditional uses of public land, which includes grazing and recreation opportunities as well. Well, we got to be very careful with that. The Endangered Species Act has been used to create harm that was unintentional. No one ever expected it to happen, but it has happened. And I think the wolf is a perfect example of that.
How do we approach it though? Because at this point, prairie dogs are already protected, and they are wreaking havoc in at least two counties of southern Utah, and they're causing problems in other places. And people are not even allowed to deal with the problem on their own private land because of this act. So what's the answer?
Well, we got to go back to my friends in the East and once again say, you know, you've got to realize you're looking at this thing through the wrong prism somehow. Do you want to try a couple of other pictures?
Oh yeah, I love your presentations. Yeah. They're great.
If we'll do this quickly, we do have one specifically dealing with the wolf issue.
Okay.
Because every time the wolf was sold as an endangered species, they had cuddly little cubs running around. Some of them had smiles on them. This is what we see. Thank heavens, thank heavens for that movie coming out now that shows what the wolves actually are. This is what we show them of what they do to family pets. And these are people who have been attacked. Teacher and a student who were eaten alive by packs of wolves. A little girl who was taken off by a wolf until the grandparents took the lawn chairs they were sitting on the beach and actually chased the wolf off. They are hurting people. You show that to people in the East, and all of a sudden it's a different concept. New Mexico, wolves were stalking kids at bus stops. This is what the school district built for the kids to stay while they're waiting for the school bus, and when the school bus drops them off again so they can be protected from wolves. And all of a sudden we're saying, look, the Endangered Species Act hasn't really saved a lot of species, less than 10%. But it has caused a lot of havoc because you guys in the East are looking at these things differently than reality is. That's another one of our selling points we're trying to deal with. We have had a hard time trying to halt the path of the Endangered Species Act because it's an easy vote for people in the East. What we're trying to do is show them what it actually does in reality, and that maybe what they were thinking it does is not what it actually does. It's going to be our effort to try and force Endangered Species Act to finally be reauthorized or be defunded. We haven't ever reauthorized it. We still keep spending money on it, and that's probably the wrong thing to do.
Wow. That's very compelling. Very compelling.
And especially when you show not only the pets, but people who have actually been killed by packs of wolves. It's a real problem.
Well, won't even go into the topic that we are considering at this point, importing wolves from Mexico now that we have the Canadian ones, and I know there's an immigration joke there somewhere, but we'll let that pass. We'll be right back with the county seat. We'll talk about energy when we return.
The State of Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration. SITLA manages 3.5 million acres in Utah lands with the express purpose of furthering the education of Utah students while promoting local industry, oil and gas, even residential development, all at the same time. Through the careful use of trust lands, we distributed more than $22 million to Utah schools last year. The State of Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration, building the state's permanent school fund.
Almost 45% of the oil produced in Utah, 7.8 million barrels, comes from Duchesne County. That oil feeds our state economy, provides job growth, and supports local business. Here in Duchesne County, we're working to make Utah an economic, cultural, and technological leader. Whether you're here for business or pleasure, Duchesne County will welcome you with open arms and invite you to explore all the beauty of the Uinta Mountains. Duchesne County, close enough for business, far enough to get away.
Let's be honest, you don't know much about Beaver County. Well, let me tell you about it. It's the birthplace of outlaw Butch Cassidy and inventor Philo T. Farnsworth. Some of the best skiing in Utah is at Eagle Point. You've got camping, Canyon Breeze Golf Course, Crusher and the Tushers, Beaver Territorial Courthouse, snowmobiling, renewable energy, Pioneer Car Show, Squeaky Cheese, Ghost Towns to explore, best water in the country, Paiute ATV trails, Old Frisco Kilns, horse racing, hunting, fishing, and it's a good place to live. Beaver County, mountains of fun. I could tell you more, but why don't you come and see it for yourself?
How do you describe the perfect destination? Mark your calendar for May 10th through the 12th for the Old School Rock Crawl in Delta, Utah. Big power, tires, and rock. Come see who can beat the best off-road track in the state. Pick your adventure in Millard County.